Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today, we are joined by Onora O'Neill. Onora O'Neill is an Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge, a crossbench member of the House of Lords, and a former president of the British Academy. She has extensively published articles and books related to the work of Immanuel Kant. In this conversation, we talk in particular about her book, Constructing Authorities, Reason, Politics, and Interpretation in Kant's Philosophy. Professor O'Neill, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Good morning.
Yes, good morning. So could you maybe briefly tell us a bit about your background? What has your philosophical journey been like? And also you have been involved with politics, so maybe you could briefly touch upon the relationship between philosophy and politics for you.
Well, for most of my life, I was doing philosophy without politics, or without politics in the narrow sense of the term. It took me a very long time to try to formulate the right questions to take to Kant's text, which is what we're mainly going to talk about. As for politics, about 20 years ago, I was asked whether I would be a member of the House of Lords, and I did not wish to be a member in a party political format. I'm what is called a crossbencher, that is to say, an independent, and since then I have attended and voted quite a lot and listened hard to the arguments.
Okay, great. Yes. So today in particular, I would like to discuss your book, Constructing Authorities, Reason, Politics, and Interpretation in Kant's Philosophy. I must say it's one of my favorite books myself, so I'm very excited to talk about it. So maybe you could briefly tell us a bit about your motivations, like why did you write this book? How did you get to kind of these topics? And maybe what is this book about from a high level perspective?
Well, I did not start with the thought that I could say something very general about Kant's philosophy. I started with the thought, is it true, as people often claim, that Kant's philosophy is a matter of empty formalism, that it's rather complicated, but has no practical implications? So I started with that rather narrower topic. Does it have any practical implications? Of course, if you're doing that, you take the formulations of the categorical imperative as your starting point. You don't think about why he formulated what he calls the supreme principle of reason in this way. And that took me really a very long time to see how you get from a formulation of the categorical imperative to one or another, and hopefully a number of principles of action which can be justified. So that was the starting point.
Okay, great. So yeah, and this book, I mean, it talks specifically about the appeal to authority. So normally people might think about authority in the sense of authority of the state or authority of the church. But in Kant's case, we're talking about the authority of reason. So how do we vindicate reason? And that's kind of the big project for Kant. And then in particular, you highlight two thoughts that are important for this, namely that reason is fundamentally practical and that the norms of reasoning must be followable by others. So maybe you can explain in a general sense, what is this project? How do we vindicate reason for Kant? And then also in particular, these two thoughts that are central to that.
I suppose that vindicating reason seems to many people an impossible project. Isn't it going to be circular? It has often been said, well, if I'm to vindicate reason, I have to give a reason for being reasonable. Well, if I have to give a reason, I have to already know what reason is. And we can see in the history of philosophy some attempts to deal with this by asserting that there is, as it were, a starting point. For example, Descartes, as we know, said, reason is complete and entire in each one of us. So you look into yourself and you see what reason is. That's a rather unfair account of Descartes, I know, but that is the thought that many people have. And then, of course, that is often met with a skeptical rejoinder. Well, you look into yourself and you see something, or you introspect, or whatever. And it finally came to me that actually, if reason can be characterized and vindicated at all, we have to ask, what do we use reason for? And we use reason above all for forms of communication. So it is to do with a plurality of people, not just one person. Introspection isn't the way you discover what it is. And that was, in a way, the big clue that it wasn't a matter of introspection. It was a matter of thinking about what makes it possible for me to engage with another person other than myself. And that is, I think, Kant's starting point.
That's
So
very
a plurality of people, not just one person.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And related to that question also, Kant sometimes make this comparison in his text, the task of reasoning, comparing it to kind of the task of constructing a building. And actually also the cover of this book also has the Tower of Babel. So he talks about the Tower of Babel specifically as kind of an illustration that relates to basically the task of reasoning. So maybe can you explain what is this notion of construction in Kant, and how does it relate maybe to the story of the Tower of Babel?
I think he finds the story of the Tower of Babel a compelling narrative because it is, so to speak, a symbol of past attempts to construct reason, a very lofty, important, significant, grand building. And guess what happened in the story of the Tower of Babel? It fell down. And then the people who had been building the Tower of Babel were scattered and unable to communicate with one another, and it was a disaster. So his thought is begin with something more modest, not, and the phrasing he uses appeals to me, where he says, all we need is a modest house on the plain, on the field of experience. We don't need a grand tower that will solve everything, but we do need something. And then if you look at the text, you see that his conception of reason is modal. That is to say, he asks, what has to be there if we are to have the possibility of communicating to another person? And that's all that he has by way of the vindication of reason. Is what are the necessary conditions of the possibility of communicating?
Great, yeah, I like that story basic, and I think it's a good visualization. And there's also constantly kind of the temptation to go for that grand building. It's something that we constantly go for again and again, and something that seems so fabulous, and we want to try it over and over again. So I think it's very interesting.
It's a constant temptation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And also, if you can tuck more into the premises, this goes for philosophical argument altogether, maybe you get more in the conclusion. So that's the temptation. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, maybe if what you tucked into the premises wasn't itself quite minimal, it will simply fail to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And in general, Kant talks about three main faculties. So the faculty of sensibility, related to experience, the faculty of understanding, our conceptual capacities, and the faculty of reason. So both the faculty of understanding and reason strive for unity, you discuss in your book. And I'm thinking, in what sense do they strive for unity? And in some sense, they're similar, these, the faculty of understanding and the faculty of reason, and in other sense, they're different. So could you maybe explain a bit these three faculties, and especially this striving for unity, what that means?
I suppose that this vocabulary of faculties is maybe not the easiest, or for us the most intuitive way of thinking about things, but I think the importance of reason is that it's a wholly generic set of capacities where you are asking what are the necessary conditions of the possibility of communication. That is, as it were, the double modal question where you're stressing the necessity and the possibility. With the faculty of understanding, we of course are thinking of a much more developed, concrete way of understanding things, for example, understanding what the natural world is like, understanding scientific theories, and so on. So you have to give an account not just of reason, but of content if you're to have an account of understanding. Mm-hmm. And that's going to go off in a number of complicated directions, but it's not that Kant is negligent about the thought of ordinary empirical knowledge or self-knowledge and all these other forms of knowledge that we have. In part, it's that he separates them from what he regards as the more fundamental capacity of reasoning.
Mhm. I see. Okay, very interesting. And also Kant talks about, or you mentioned kind of the clue to understanding the vindication of reason lies in realizing that it's a reflexive task. So and then you say we first have to look at the available materials and capacities. So what are we working with before we can kind of start or begin this task? So can you maybe explain in what sense it's reflexive and also in what sense it is a task?
I suppose the sense in which it's reflexive is that we find ourselves with a great welter of different ideas and impressions and thoughts. So it's not that we're lacking in content.
Mm.
We have some content. Reason is the set of moves by which we seek to organize it, and also to, and this is why I found the word vindication important, to justify certain claims to others. So that if I seek to justify to someone my claim that the sun rises in the east, or whatever you like, I will have all sorts of bits of evidence, but how I put them together will, at the very least, have to rely on principles which the other person, my interlocutor, can also follow. And I suppose if you wanted to put it down to the most simple and intuitive thought, it is that I cannot convince another person of something that he or she cannot follow. So if they can't understand it, I can't convince them. If I want to reason with them, I have to be able to produce something that they can in principle follow. And what I suppose it took me a long time to realize is, in a way, that is all that the categorical imperative is. The categorical imperative tells us to act only on that principle through which we can at the same time will that it be a universal law, meaning that it can be a law for everybody, not that it is a law or anything, but that it's something that can be followed by the other party. So if you see, one's then thinking the really important thing about reasoning is that we presuppose that we have a plurality, we would say a plurality of intelligent beings, a plurality of beings meeting the conditions for the others to follow them. And that is so different from the old Cartesian idea of reason being complete and entire in each one of us.
Yeah, that starting point is very important and keeps coming back. And maybe also to clarify, maybe on the notion of vindication, that's not the same as proof, right? That we have to make a distinction between proof and vindication, because some people might say, oh, I want to see the proof if I really am going to take that to be the answer. So how do we maybe separate those terms?
Well, maybe we say, look, if you want a proof, you know that any proof requires certain assumptions, certain premises, certain starting points. That is why it is so difficult to provide a proof of reason, because it seems that you've only got into circularity if you do that. But if you think that about the context of reason, think about reasoning as an activity that we conduct with one another, then we can see that there is a very slight necessary condition. We can reason with one another only if that which we offer one another is something that we take it, the other can follow in thought, or if it's a reason for action, could in principle adopt as a reason for action.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And maybe one other thing that Kant talks about is, Kant states, and I like the sentence, reason is no dictator. So,
Isn't
because
it
some
nice?
people, yeah, some people might think, okay, Kant has this account of reason and it's telling us to do all those things. But Kant does say, no, reason is no dictator. It doesn't exactly tell you have to do this. So maybe you can elaborate on what kind of this statement means.
I suppose that in the history of philosophy, and far more than philosophy, we would often find people assuming reason requires, reason dictates, reason shows that, as it were, casting reasoning as something that is not merely authoritative, but actually, as the metaphor has it, a dictator. Kant thinks that it is merely the necessary condition of the possibility of communicating with another. So I emphasize repeatedly how important plurality is to Kant. And when he talks about human reason, he is right at the start of the critique of pure reason, thinking about a plurality of rational beings. He doesn't necessarily, by the way, think that they have to be biological human beings. There are passages scattered through some of his essays where he talks about other to us unknown rational beings of the universe. So he thinks there could be other sorts of rational beings. He doesn't rule that out. But what is important to him is that there's a plurality of beings.
Mm-hmm. And actually, one topic also comes to mind where you mention that our rationality isn't limited. Some people take our rationality to be limited, but you take a different approach to that. Could you maybe explain that? Like, in what sense rationality isn't limited to us?
Well, I mean, it's only in one sense. Rationality this is quite a modest conception of reason compared to, say, some that the rationalists have put forward. But it is limited to us, where us means other beings with these capacities. It doesn't necessarily mean the human species.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we, I suppose, would in the 20th century say that we have seen considerable capacities to reason in certain primates and perhaps certain other mammals, even certain birds, limited compared to our own, but and we can imagine beings with enhanced capacities, and indeed some of our friends who work on AI imagine that they're going in that direction.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, great. And when people also, of course, have their objections against, indeed, the vindication of reason, and you kind of point out specifically three of those, and a few of them we already talked about, but one is that it is invoking an arbitrary starting point. The second one is the problem of circularity. That's what we talked about a bit before. And then an unending regress. So maybe you can briefly touch upon all three and say, okay, how do we kind of respond to those objections?
I've never found the unending regress one too bothering,
Okay.
because in a sense what we have to have as a minimum, if we're going to reason with others, is a way of making the proposition that we assert or the action that we propose accessible to those others. That's the only condition we have to meet. Now, once you're in a process of reasoning and it's dialogical, then of course someone may say, I just don't see that, I don't see that this follows, and so on. But all the time, the touchstone is that both parties can follow the same very abstract path, because this is a modal vindication of reason, and that is why it is a weaker one than that proposed by the rationalists, or indeed, I suppose, many others.
And maybe focusing a little bit to like the political side of things. So some anarchists actually think that they outright reject the notion of authority. They think this notion doesn't have any place in the political sphere. So I was just thinking, what would you say to those people? Because you do talk about when people kind of reject authority in general, that they might go kind of a postmodernist route, where kind of nothing is that touchstone and kind of we're in the wild. So maybe what would you say to those people?
Well, of course, Kant says, on the one hand, reason is no dictator, but he also has many interesting metaphors, and we are relying a bit here on metaphors to understand things, where he points out that it is also not a matter of anarchy, and he contrasts dictators, and it's an interesting metaphor, nomads. Nomads in the desert who have no as it were, landmarks at all, who can't orient themselves, who cannot, to use the title of one of his late essays, who cannot orient themselves in thinking. So he would say arbitrary authority is something that we cannot rely on, because that would be to, as it were, accept that we don't have reasons. But equally, the idea that anything goes, which I suppose might be the postmodernist fantasy, it doesn't enable one to engage with others, even willing others who are seeking to engage. So you have to see that anarchy doesn't work either. And I think it's quite an interesting thing. I don't know if anybody's done it, to look at all the passages in which Kant relies on these political metaphors. And remember, authority here is a metaphor. It's not talking about state authority. And anarchy is again a metaphor. It's not talking about literal anarchy. But these metaphors are, I think, illuminating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And do you think that he uses these metaphors because we cannot touch them directly when we would actually like put them into examples, or what is it about these metaphors that why do they play such an important function?
Well, they are, among other things, present in human culture for millennia, aren't they? Because after all, the Tower of Babel story, to go back to that, is a contrast between the powerful state of Babylon trying to erect this enormous tower, the authority, and then the dispersal, the losing touch, the uh, incapacity to communicate for other reasons. So it's neither a dictator nor will anarchy do. And that is why I think anything goes. And of course, not all postmodernists are quite so extreme about this, but anything goes is probably a bit of an illusion.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, and
if you want to communicate with others, if there are other stories in philosophy, aren't there, about the madman in Nietzsche who doesn't need to communicate with others.
Okay, I see. Yeah. So in Kant's work, like in his essay, What is Enlightenment, he makes a very important distinction between public and private reason, and this also plays quite a big role in your book. So maybe can you explain this distinction and why has it been overlooked maybe in this essay, and kind of what's the importance of it?
Well, of course, the distinction has come back in a slightly different version in a great deal of 20th century and contemporary political philosophy. But for Kant, the distinction between the public use of reason and the private use of reason is that in the public use of reason, I make no assumption about the others to whom I try to make what I say intelligible. So it has to be something that they could follow in thought or could adopt for action. But in private contexts, I can make some additional assumptions. For example, well, I think he certainly likes going on holidays in Spain, so I'll make that a premise. Or he certainly knows how to ski, so I'll make that a premise, whatever it might be. So of course, we have a great deal of discussion with others where we have, as we would say, some shared assumptions. There's nothing wrong with the shared assumptions, but one has to recognize that they are assumptions.
Mm-hmm. I see.
And
Very
so for certain purposes, they're fine. But if you want to talk about what could we establish relying only on reason, you can't take those private assumptions. And that is Kant's conception of the difference between the private and the public use of reason. And of course, in what we have been talking about hitherto, we're talking about the public use of reason. We're talking about that bare minimum where it could be accessible to any other. But in everyday life, we make many, many other assumptions, which is why we take it, this was intended for this audience, or this friend, or that acquaintance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also you also contrast Kant's constructivist approach with Rawls' constructivist approach. So maybe you can briefly explain kind of the difference, like how does Rawls go in a different direction than Kant's constructivism, and kind of how should we evaluate that? Why did he do that? For what reasons? And why should we accept those reasons or reject them?
Well, I think that John Rawls, who was my PhD supervisor and was a very fine Kant scholar, but the particular use to which he put the metaphor of construction was a bit different in that, particularly in theory of justice, he's thinking about a plurality of people who agree on something. So there is that additional premise about agreement. And that, I think, becomes more apparent in his late work in political liberalism and other writings, where he's thinking about people who agree on certain assumptions. And for Kant, that would be, as it were, an arbitrary additional premise. So that Rawls then ends up, and we have to remember he's doing political philosophy, he's ending up appealing to agreement among fellow citizens in a bounded, liberal, democratic society. So, of course, it's much, much closer to political agreement. And I think Habermas is very much in that direction too. They are thinking much more about political philosophy and not about reasoning in its wide generality.
Yeah, also one sentence you use is addressing the world at large, which I like also, that it fits with
That's
kind of yeah.
It's a nice phrase, isn't it? Whereas in democracies, we aren't technically addressing the world at large, we are addressing the fellow citizens.
Exactly. Yeah, that's clear. So and maybe also, I mean, we already mentioned several times, talking indeed about this starting point, the uncoordinated plurality of agents, and it's very crucial to kind of understand that in what sense it is a minimal assumption. Of course, we all have to make some starting assumptions, but in what sense is this minimal? And one sentence you also mentioned there is, we are doers before we are thinkers or citizens. So I think that's also interesting. Kind of what are the implications for that? Of course, we talked about this starting point, and we talked about some of the implications, but maybe again, in what sense, if we say we are doers before we are thinkers, what's the result? Like, what comes from that?
A lot of thoughts in that. I think we are. I suppose that what one's thinking about is reasoning as having an audience as well as an agent. Reasoning, again, as taking place among a plurality of beings. And communication is, in my view, a form of doing. Now, we who live very abstract lives may tend to forget this, and we think that doing is when you do your shopping or cook your meal. But actually, thinking is a form of action, and communicating is a form of action. I think communication is a key term in this. And one way in which one can make all this more intuitive is to say Kant is interested in the necessary conditions of the possibilities of communication. And if I don't think about those necessary conditions, and I don't mean we have to reflect on them, but if I don't do that, I might talk past others, I might fail to understand them, I might not engage in any form of dialogue.
I see. Actually, it's interesting. One thing I noticed is indeed that in your book, it normally mentions necessary conditions of thought, action, and communication, but here you do seem to emphasize communication. I'm not sure if that's different from what you previously thought, or if communication was always central kind of in this.
I suppose the word interaction would have done it as well, except interaction is more abstract. Communication, I think, brings us back to the area where we really deploy reasoning, where we're thinking about, how do I organize my thinking so that another could, in principle, follow it.
I see. Shifting maybe gears a little bit to Kant's account of autonomy. You mentioned that his account of autonomy is quite distinctive and innovative, and you contrast it with accounts of autonomy in a contemporary sense that maybe focus on individual independence and rational autonomy. Can you maybe explain these different accounts of autonomy and in what sense Kant's account is distinctive?
Kant is in a way not distinctive, he's merely traditional. That is to say, the word autonomy is originally from ancient Greece, and an autonomous city was a city that made its own laws, whereas a colony had its laws made for it by the mother city. So the fundamental use of the word autonomous in European thought was as a jurisprudential term, the distinction between the autonomous city and the dependent city. That usage, as far as I can make out, it is still Kant's usage, is still the early modern usage, is still there even in, guess what, John Stuart Mill, who only uses the word autonomy, as far as I can find it, once in his book on representative government, where he's talking about using it straightforwardly in the jurisprudential sense. Now, what we find in the 20th century is that people take autonomy in a completely different sense as a feature of individuals. And if I were reading it back onto Kant, what's happened in the 20th century, reading it back onto Kant, I would say that whereas Kant had drawn a very clear distinction, which we often pick up in German as the distinction between Wille and Willkür, and Wille is what gets translated in some contexts as autonomy, and Willkür is Augustinian liberum arbitrium. It is the power of choice. And the power of choice is not what Kant means by autonomy. What he means by autonomy is the much more general conception of the power to act on a principle which could be a principle for all. That's why there is a formula of autonomy as one way of expressing the categorical imperative. Now, in my view, in contemporary writing on autonomy, the Kantian notion is completely buried and gone. And what people mean is individual choice, and they deify individual choice, and then we see that they're not in the least interested in the vindication of reason or the categorical imperative. They're interested in individual independence, what would in the past perhaps have been called willfulness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that take, but also one thing actually that might be interesting to think about or to add basically to that discussion is also now a lot of people are talking about relational autonomy. So they are trying to bring this plurality back, but now we're talking about kind of an actuality of plurality. So it kind of made a turn back to plurality, but it still forgot kind of the Kantian roots in that, I think.
Well, I'm not sure how fruitful that is going to be, but you know, I can see why people feel the need to try to get away from hyper-individualism. Mm-hmm. And we can also see how very influential that is in the public philosophies of our time. We can see the extraordinary flowering of libertarian economics. Mm-hmm. We can see in the neglect of public goods, if I may say so, which I think has been one of the catastrophic contexts in which we have ended up with this pandemic. Mm-hmm. Because public goods, above all, include the conditions of public discourse, public reason, the rule of law, public health, environmental standards. All these get neglected.
Yeah, that's very interesting to see some of these consequences, basically.
I think so. And I think when you look at, for example, the steps that Mr. Trump has taken to try to deal with, or perhaps it is to deflect consideration of the pandemic, you can see it's not without its very practical consequences when you neglect public goods, all the way from public reason to public health.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. That actually refers to one other question I had, like, how do we take conception of public reason and actually put it into practice? So what are some measures or approaches or policies? Because we see if we don't do kind of certain things, then these have consequences. So maybe how can we get Kant's conception of public reason and put some measures to it, basically?
Well, I think that I would worry less about getting back to what people refer to as normality, because the way we have lived the last 20 years was quite unusual in human history. And if you think about all the things that have changed with globalization, the ever longer supply chains, the ever greater fragmentation of control and ownership, the many, many different features that our economies and societies have produced. And I think we will need to think about whether they have gone too far.
Mm-hmm. I see. That's very interesting. Yeah.
So I think it does have political implications, and they have to do with how do you preserve the public sphere, not just for reasoning, but for social, cultural, economic activity.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And maybe related to the notion of autonomy is the notion of self-legislation. So maybe people, when they hear that word, it seems to be indeed a self who's doing this legislating. But for you also, it has kind of an impersonal conception. And I know it relates to autonomy, but maybe could you elaborate on this specific term as well?
I think it helps to go back to the ancient meaning of autonomy. The self that was doing the legislating, after all, was not the individual, it was the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so the autonomous city was a city where the laws were made not by an individual, but by the city, by the citizens in communication with one another. And and then you're straight back into the communicative basis of Kantian autonomy.
Very interesting. And some people also have a kind of labeled Kant as a social contract theorist. You kind of define different sorts of or types of justification, and then you kind of say, if I state you, if Kant is the most adequate of the social contract theorists, this may ironically be because he abandons the idea of the social contract as some agreement or contract, actual or hypothetical, and thinks of it simply as formulating the necessary conditions for the possibility of universal consent to a political order for unsociable yet interacting rational beings. So yeah, maybe elaborate on that paragraph.
Well, I don't think I can express it more briefly than that.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Interacting is the key notion there, that if you're to interact, then you have to be in possible communication with others, and that puts some constraints on the principles you adopt. So I don't think I've entirely got the thought that lay behind your question, but I'll stop it there.
Yeah, no, I think that basically answers it. So maybe also going back to the political sphere, this was actually something I noticed that I thought was very interesting, that Kant's account of international and cosmopolitan right and justice relate to political idealism and realism. So some might think that Kant is a political idealist, but you say, no, actually, there are these idealist aspects, but there's also kind of these realist aspects to Kant's political thought. So I thought that was very interesting and in some sense surprising to me. So maybe could you explain that a bit more? In what sense he is a realist, in what sense he is an idealist?
I'm not sure I can do that just off the top of my head, but let me try. I think he is an idealist in that he thinks that certain principles, for example, principles that are not the same as the human rights standards, but related to them, and in the background, principles such as not coercing others, not deceiving others, not enslaving others, principles that could not be principles for all. So the vindication of a set of moral and political principles follows quite naturally from this account of the vindication of reason. Now, there are lots of questions to be raised there about how many principles, and are they a sufficient set, and how are they related to contemporary human rights principles. They're clearly not the same, but they overlap heavily. So there are lots of questions about the principles that we adopt there. But I think you also wanted to me to say something about the sense in which he's a realist as well as an idealist. So he's an idealist in that he thinks there are these principles that you can vindicate. He's a realist in that he thinks that what you actually do in the world in which human beings live together has to be, if you like, quite coherent and based on accurate views about the results of acting in certain ways or not acting in certain ways. So his realism politically, I think, is clear enough when you, and sometimes it would seem to us very old-fashioned, but I think that it's a very, very conventional sense in which he's a realist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And maybe as a last question, Kant famously talks about the three fundamental questions of philosophy. What can I know? What ought I to do? And what may I hope for? So you talk about the notion of Kant's notion of reasoned hope. So I know this is a big question, but maybe can you sketch this account of what is reasoned hope? And also in particular, you emphasize that he kind of states, what may I hope for, and not necessarily what must I hope for. So what's the difference between those two questions?
Well, I think that, of course, I've been very interested in, at a certain stage in doing this work on in Kant's late philosophy of religion. It is mostly quite late, and he does alter the fundamental question from being what must I hope, which within certain theological traditions, we must hope for the life to come. What may I hope, which is again a modal question and a weaker modal statement. I suppose that one of the things he is thinking about is that if we have an account of human knowledge, and as the theoretical deployment of reason, and an account of what ought to be done, the practical deployment of reason, we may see that they don't always pull together. They don't always mesh. And then we have to ask the question, how will things pan out? Hence the question, what may I hope, not what must I hope? So that hope, for parts of the theological tradition anyhow, has been one more question about prediction. And if you think about Leibnizian optimism, you're thinking about if this is the best of all possible worlds, then I may hope for the best of all possible outcomes. And that's a certain view based on prediction. For Kant, hope is different. Hope is not in the same way defeated by evidence. I was very struck years ago reading a book by the widow of the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, and Nadia Mandelstam wrote a book under the title Hope Against Hope. And there have been some very dark times in the past century. We may be in some very dark times now too. And the question is, so does that mean don't hope because nothing good's going to happen? And if we were dealing with Leibnizian optimism, you might say of the present time in the middle of this pandemic, you can't be very optimistic either about public health or about economic futures and many other things, or indeed for some people about survival. So optimism is, although it's frequently people's attitude and other people are pessimistic, but it's not what interests Kant, because what he's looking at is the possibility of hope in dark times. Now that's a very mid-20th century theme, but and a very counter-Leibnizian theme, but perhaps we don't need to feel everything's on the up and up in order to have hope for the future.
I see. Very interesting. And also maybe one thing that maps onto that is you talk about this worldly hope and otherworldly hope as maybe a way of thinking about hope. And then this worldly hope would, for example, maybe be indeed the notion of progress. We're hoping for progress. And that might be something that many people adopt without kind of adopting otherworldly hope. So I thought that was also a very good way of clarifying.
Yeah. And many people have written on that in the 20th century, and Bloch is a good example. So that there are lots of things that we can hope, but which aren't so much a matter of optimism or pessimism. Optimism, of course, is much beloved, but I'm very struck by people who manage to maintain hope in dark times, although they don't pull the wool over their eyes, as we say. They aren't sort of, what is the phrase? It's not Pollyanna. I can't remember much about Pollyanna, but mindless optimism. So everything's going to turn out all right. Just wait. We'll lift the lockdown and nobody more will get ill. That would be perhaps a bit of mindless optimism. But hope that we will overcome it is another matter.
Yeah, actually, that's also interesting as a final thought. Kind of that reminded me of my previous conversation with Robert Loudon, where he talks about indeed Kant's kind of view on radical evil, how it was also different from the Enlightenment, and kind of looking radical even in the eye and still having that account of hope might even seem more interesting to people when you have that account of human nature, and then still building this account of hope might even seem more impressing to a lot of people.
And you can see how fundamental freedom is to that. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. You mean in the sense that we can still choose, even in the face of radical evil or bad things happening around us?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, this has been so interesting and so amazing to talk to you again. So thank you so much, Professor O'Neill. And if you have any parting words to the audience?
Well, I have my apologies for not being very good at getting zooming at the start, but this technology does work once you get connected, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.